Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Tonight's broadcast is about accountability, and I think it's probably one of the aspects, one of the ideas or experiences that parents hope for when they send a child to a program. As I talk about it tonight, I'm going to talk about the complexities of accountability, about how to facilitate and to encourage accountability, how to model it. I'm going to talk about what it is and what it is not, because I think that sometimes we can start to border on other aspects, other ideas besides accountability. So let's get right into it. I wrote this and I put this idea out there to begin. The road to accountability goes to awareness. And in order to travel that road, one must do battle with guilt and shame. So the first thing that I will tell you, and parents ask this question all the time of their children, is their dishonesty, their denial. Is that because they don't want to get in trouble? And of course, that's a motivating factor in accountability and fessing up or admitting to things that you have done and taking ownership of them. Of course, that can be a part of it. But in many cases, because I worked with clients in all types of settings at all ages, the most potent factor in preventing accountability is shame or to a lesser extent, guilt. And so we have to do battle with that. And as we facilitate accountability, we're not going to want to fan the flames of shame and guilt. The problem is that so much of what we do tends to do that. We're inclined at times to provoke a defense that prevents us from getting what we're hoping for, from getting what we're needing. A couple of years ago, we changed one of our assignments, one of the three pillars, from the letter of accountability to the letter of awareness. And part of the reason that I did that is because I thought that there was this energy in accountability that was punitive. And really, what we're talking about is somebody's awareness and ownership of something. And in fact, sometimes, and this is one of those principles early on that I think some people miss in the process, is that sometimes a great deal of grief and shame, a lot of apologies actually get in the way of accountability. And that can be unnerving to people that get that letter from their children because a lot of them are surprised by the lack of seeming remorse. But when you're accountable for something, you're not asking for anything in return. Specifically, you're not asking people to soothe you, right? Accountability comes from a courageous and a capable place. And it doesn't ask for much, if anything, in return. One of the three pillars of the assignments at Evoke, one of them is the impact letter that children write to parents. This is where they describe the things that you've done that have hurt them, that have upset them. And in our curriculum, we have the letter of accountability, or excuse me, the letter of awareness. We have that in front of the impact letter. But I've learned a couple of things after doing this for a lot of years, and that is, I think you can tell more about somebody's accountability from their impact letter than you can from their letter of accountability. Couple of things. Many clients are therapeutically savvy. You know this. You tell us this. Not all of them, of course, but many of them are. And they know how to complete an assignment when it's given to them. They know how to approximate the language that's being asked of them. So when you ask somebody who has this trait, this skill set to write something, you're going to get this kind of scripted, manualized version of accountability and awareness. But if you ask somebody to write a letter that says, tell me about the ways that I've impacted you, the ways that I've hurt you, you're going to hear in that, because it's not asking for it on the front end, right? On the surface, it's not asking for awareness or accountability for oneself. So you're going to see it leak through the lack of it or the presence of it more. It's a more of a projective test, something that we don't ask, that we don't walk in through the front door and ask. So I sometimes like to switch the two, especially when clients, students are over anxious, over eager to write a letter of accountability, to kind of check off the boxes. And a lot of times when they do that and I ask them to write the impact letter, they're pretty resistant to it. They don't want to do it. In fact, they feel uncomfortable with the fact that these assignments have been reordered by me or by the therapist. But like I said, I think it can be an effective way of kind of getting to the point without walking in the front door and announcing yourself. Sometimes when you listen to a child begin to describe what's gone on in their life and what's happened, I use this phrase, listen to it as if it were a dream. In other words, detach yourself somewhat in the early stages of accountability or awareness. Detach yourself from the facts, from the details. We're going to get there. We have the same long-term goal, right? But in the initial stages, the story is going to be pretty obtuse, pretty unclear. It's going to be difficult for them. And so we reward successive approximations. That's a behavioral technique where you reward a step toward the ultimate goal of awareness and accountability. Like I said before, in order to get to this awareness and this accountability, defenses have to be lowered. And I use this analogy all the time, talk about it on a lot of these broadcasts. If somebody builds a wall around themselves to protect themselves from real or perceived threats, and they see somebody approaching with chisels and pickaxes and jackhammers to try to remove the wall, they're going to be left with really one instinct, and that is to reinforce it. Maybe run could be another, or to preemptively mount an attack on the person approaching them. And what is interesting about this is parents and some therapists call this love. They point out to the person who's built a wall around themselves, this is not a wall protecting you. This is a prison that you've created for yourself. Maybe at some point in your life, you needed to be protected from the things that you're protecting yourself from, but not anymore. And so this is really a prison. But it doesn't matter if we don't call these things, if we call these things loving and caring, it's a threat. This is the kind of thing that begins to separate the idea of therapy from a layperson's perspective or an untrained therapist's perspective about what therapy really is. You know, we're in the business of treating defenses. That's really what we're doing. Most lay people, after reading a book or two on mental health, could outline some ideas around being mentally healthy or addiction recovery, right? That doesn't take a lot of talent. You get that in your first couple of years of graduate school. What really becomes the art of it as a therapist, and hopefully this is something that we can borrow as parents and loved ones, what really becomes the art in it is what we do to not increase or provoke defenses to be doubled or reinforced. We start to respond, to treat people in such a way that they lower their defenses. So we call it caring, we call it love, we call it concern, but the fact of the matter is it's a threat. And I wanted to say, and this is a really important moment to point this out, that doesn't mean, when I talk about this tonight, I have to say this. It doesn't mean that you all have to be the subject, or subjected to, I should say, abuse, right? Cruelty. Somebody beating up on you, blaming you. Even though in the early stages, it can sound like that. You know, it can sound like blame. It can sound less accurate than the truth. But the fact of the matter is, it's very important to understand that that's a step toward accountability and awareness. It's a step towards your child or somebody getting to the truth. And the greater capacity you have to hold space for that, the better you are. But if you need to take space, if you need to shut down conversations, if the apology, as it were, is more punishing than nothing, you can walk away and remove yourself from the conversation or the situation. So many people worry about somebody kind of becoming fixated in a blaming posture or a victim posture. I hear that all the time with our students, with our clients. I hear it with colleagues. I hear it across the spectrum of treatment and therapy. And what I often say is, in the early stages, the best way to reduce the amount of time that someone stays stuck is to not fight it, not meet it with a force. And so when somebody says, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, my parents are crazy, my parents are idiots, my point is, and I don't say it in these words, but my point is, okay, I believe you. I remember early in my career, I saw myself as a detective, and I was going to sleuth out, right? I was going to figure out the truth. How crazy, how unhealthy are these parents? And after a while, I realized it it's okay, whatever you think and you feel. I used to say this with my clients early on in the process. I would say, your parents are an idiot, and you're an idiot, and I'm an idiot. We're all idiots. And you probably haven't met the worst of them yet. You're going to have teachers and professors and employers that are idiots. You're going to have friends and spouses, and for sure, you're going to have children that are all idiots. And so life becomes about how you deal with that. And I think we all end up fighting the battle of arguing about how much of an idiot the other person is in an equation, instead of just letting it pass through us, not making a point to argue or to defend. Sometimes that can be because children, especially in treatment, they will weaponize skills. I see this all the time with our clients. They get a skill set, and even in the first few weeks, many of them start to kind of punish the newer students with the new skills, right? They require a kind of precision of everybody around them. When parents come out for a visit or in parent letters, they kind of beat people up for not getting it perfectly right. And that's where we get to say, well, we're just people. We get to be people. We get to be human. I'm going to reserve the right to make mistakes in this process. Doesn't mean I'm not open to feedback or suggestions or ideas, but I'm not willing to be beat up over it. And just like weaponizing the skills, it's kind of the same thing that I described earlier. The young therapist often thinks, or the young staff member often thinks, that the talent is in confronting the client. I've sat in groups for decades, literally for decades. In our program and other programs where new therapists and new staff will say to the student, you're justifying, you're rationalizing, intellectualizing, you're in denial. And I've pulled those individuals apart, the ones at least that work in our program, and I say, it's not that you're wrong about that, but I'm not sure that that's the most effective way to encourage somebody to open up. And we might develop a skill set around that helps them to open up. And that goes with weaponizing skills, right? Your children are going to become experts at the I feel statement and at listening skills, excuse me. And we tell them all the time, your parents haven't been immersed in it. And so you're going to have to be patient with them, like we were with you in the first few weeks of treatment. And so that fear of clients staying stuck, it's really about us, right? It's really about, I say this all the time in this work, you don't get to be right anymore. But what you do get to be is a self, and that is much better than being right. You get to be a person, and being a person is way better than being right. If you want more about this, I did a podcast on the book Motivational Interviewing, which I first read 20 some years ago, and I recently reread it to do a podcast called Motivational Interviewing Informed Parenting. And what happened between the first time I read it and the most recent time I read it is they filled in the appendix with page after page after page of research and study that shows that the best way to get people to change, to encourage or facilitate change, was not through confrontation. but through a much gentler process. So again, we're talking about accountability tonight, but sometimes the things that we do prevent it or get in the way of it. So if you want to learn more about that, go back to the webinar or the podcast on motivational and interviewing informed parenting. The last thing I want to say in this kind of introduction slide to accountability tonight is parents ask me all the time about modeling accountability. I say one of the things that I often say to anybody when you're dealing with somebody in your life that's an addict or that's really compromised or demonstrating a significant mental health issue, what can you do? And one of the things I say is start off with an apology. Find something to apologize for. If you need help, we can talk about that. Or if you're married, they can help you with that. I joke around. But you're modeling accountability. You're kind of laying down the weapons that you call love and caring. And you're starting to take off your armor. And when somebody approaches you without armor and without tools, it's safer. I always saw that in groups. Students and clients would complain that the group didn't feel safe. And I would say that the best way to increase safety in the group is not to point it out, but to model vulnerability. It's not guaranteed. You can get hurt. But it's the best way to encourage vulnerability and openness. But parents will say to me that my child will use it against me. And what I say is, it's impossible. I can't be too emphatic about that. It's impossible for somebody to use it against you if it doesn't matter, right? If I admit that I'm an idiot in a certain kind of way, I know that. I'm not doing it for effect, right? I'm not faking it. I'm not asking for something in return. I just know it. In this area in my life, I'm kind of an idiot sometimes, a lot of the time. Nobody can beat me up with it, right? It actually is liberating. It's only when we have to be right. It's only when we're in a power struggle. And to abandon the ground of our self-righteousness can be frightening. And if we live in a paradigm, and most of us have lived in it to some degree and have been raised in it, about who's more right, it's going to be pretty threatening to be accountable, to own it, to admit to it. But when we get into this kind of recovery that I'm describing, when we get on this path of mental health progress, nobody can use it against you. I used to say to the therapist, the last defense is just admitting who you are. And then what are they going to do? And the greatest minds, leaders, and teachers that we look at in our lives, they just admit it. They're not great because they talk about or think that they're great. They're great because they know they're a buffoon. And there's no pretense. There's no need for a defense, right? That's what self-esteem looks like. Self-esteem looks like I'm kind of a moron sometimes. I'm kind of stupid sometimes. I make a lot of mistakes. I'm weak in this area. That's what self-esteem looks like. It doesn't look like talking about how great you are. That's why enlightenment, it's not a journey of getting better, although that happens on it. It's a journey of embracing and looking at and becoming more and more comfortable with your own darkness. So what is accountability? First of all, I like the word ownership. I own it. It's my choice. Yes, my parents, my mother was anxious. She was uptight. She was unavailable. My dad wasn't in my life, right? I can describe my mom yelled, my dad yelled. I can describe that. That's part of my story. But my choice to use drugs or alcohol, my descent into an angry life is mine. It's mine. That's part of what growing up is. And yes, I'm gonna have discussions with some people, my therapists and others, and put that in the greater context. But it's still mine to own. I used to ask this question when teaching our staff. I would say, what's the difference between an excuse and an explanation, or between justifying and explaining? The difference between justifying and explaining is the feeling of being threatened. In other words, if I'm explaining something to you and you stop me, my response is, oh, okay. I don't need to tell you that. I was trying to, but I can let that go. Right? That's an explanation. But justifying or excuse comes from a place of feeling threatened and not safe. And again, we didn't grow up that our feelings were enough. We had to prove it or be right or gather evidence, right? It was like we were constantly on a court trial where we had to convince the jury that how we felt and what we wanted was legitimate. But when you shift the project to being a person, then you get to feel what you feel. You get to feel your feelings. Accountability is awareness. That's why we changed the name. It's about saying, I'm aware. I'm kind of aware of what happened and I'm aware of my part in it. And this is important. I'll talk about this a little bit later. In relationships, this goes to your children, your partnerships, in relationships. If we were to quantify blame, okay? Even if you were 1% to blame, accountability and awareness takes 100% responsibility and ownership for your part. I'll say that again. Even if you're just 1% to blame, if we're measuring it that way. Accountability and awareness take 100% ownership of your part. Here's what I did. Here's what I did in the relationship. And you don't need to quantify it or give it a number. You just own your part. And so you can see as we work with your children, that's what we start to get to. I want to hear. I mean, I have to say this very emphatically. Virtually all therapy, I'm working in addiction, mental health, especially with children, and young adults, but I would even say with adults, has some significant aspect of saying, tell me where you've been hurt. And we're going to start with the people that were closest to you. Tell me about your parents. Then about your siblings and your friends and your teachers. Tell me about that. I want to be there and listen to it. I want to understand what it's been like to be you, how you got to where you are right now. Now, there are some therapies that don't like to go in the past, but we don't subscribe to those, and those are I think, pretty limited, got a pretty limited scope. So virtually all therapies do this, some version of that. Tell me the story. Tell me where your trauma was. The rage in therapy today is trauma-based therapy. You know, what are the adverse child experiences? They call them ACEs that you experienced in your childhood. And we know from brain science and from imaging how it affects the brain. And we know then that effect in the brain, how that affects day-to-day living. So I'm so glad that the science is showing us that regardless of whether you have a philosophy that you shouldn't look back in the past, it's there. It wired your brain. So you start to talk about this. That's what we talk about. And as you heal, right, as you're not feeling threatened anymore, and as you get hurt, you start to talk about your accountability. That's what growing up is. I have spent 30 years in therapy as a client. Longer than I've been a therapist, which is almost about 30 years. I've spent 30 years in therapy as a client, and I've spent a lot of hours talking about my father and my mother and others. And parallel to that, probably because of that, I've also started to talk about my piece of it. I'm aware that it doesn't matter what my mother and my father did. I carry it around now. Now it's mine to deal with. Just as it's theirs to deal with whatever they carried around, and my grandparents, and so on and so on. So it comes together. And if we have the capacity, as therapists, hopefully we do, and as parents, if we have the capacity, we develop a capacity to hear it, to listen, to be an audience member, to our children, we get to be a part of that healing. And again, it's also okay to take care of yourself. You can only do what you can do. And if it's too much, that's why it's important to go to therapy, to have somebody that can be there for you, right? That's who we lean on in our lives. We lean on our sponsors, our friends, our peers, our therapists. We lean on them so we don't have to lean on our children. It's too heavy, too much for them to bear. Shame, guilt, control, and fear get in our way of listening to somebody. They get in the way of us being open to the process, right? It can't be more clear than this, and to say that shame and guilt do not motivate one toward openness and awareness. Period. They do not. They are barriers to awareness. We have to learn. This is how powerful this is. We actually have to learn to deal with and to feel shame and guilt in order to become more aware and accountable in our lives. So the things that we were taught, that our culture teaches us, that motivate people toward accountability and awareness, are actually barriers. In the short term, there can be some battles that are won. In the short term, it can motivate. In the long term, it's absolutely destructive to the process of awareness and accountability. And so we have to let go of that and understand that. That's why therapy is different than other relationships. Qualitative, good therapy is different than other relationships. Like I've said all along, we have to learn to understand what it means to be a self, a person, a human. That's the work. And then as we start to do battle with guilt and shame, fear and our attempts to control, we start to become a self, a person. And then we can create an integrated story that lasts, not short-term behavioral change that motivates us in the short run, but long-term integration and healing. That's what we're about. Talk about awareness and accountability. Part of it obviously is honesty. Honesty with self. I talk about it being part confession. That's not all of it, but that's part of it. Admitting to at least one other person and to those that you have harmed. And in the 12-step world, they'll call it making an amends. It's okay at the time of doing this to recognize the functions that our symptoms serve. Like, I dealt with my anxiety with drugs or anger or self-harm, whatever it is. It's okay to put it in that context as a part of it. And that can be hard for some parents because we've been told that anytime we put our behavior in a context, we're justifying or rationalizing it. That's not necessarily true at all. We own our choices, and we're willing to deal with the consequences that come. That's why as you begin to exchange accountability with your child, especially when they're becoming more and more accountable to you, you get to have your reactions and consequences. I mean, there's an awareness about how those impact somebody. They might not feel safe, but part of the measure of somebody's accountability is, are they willing to let you be angry and upset and hurt? And if they're not quite there yet. True, profound, authentic accountability allows for other people to be upset and have their reaction. Limited or tenuous accountability and awareness put limits on how other people can react. So you become tolerant and patient with the consequences. Recognizing that people can lose trust. That's a part of it. Parents have sometimes this feeling like, I should trust my child. And the child will say to the parent, the fact that you don't trust me is ruining my esteem. I hear children share that some version of that with their parents. And my response is, you get to feel the level of trust you get to feel. And absolutely work it out with a therapist and see if you're stuck somewhere. If you're dealing with some unprocessed trauma from this situation or something else, that's fine. That's fine. But there's no obligation to trust. And authentic accountability allows for someone to distrust you. and the logical and natural consequences that come along with it. When we think about a child writing a letter of awareness, we like I said, we determine how ready they are. There's no set length to it. And remember, it's a means to an end. I would probably, on average, have a child write 3 versions of a letter of awareness or a letter of accountability, as it used to be called. And the differences between the versions were fairly subtle. So they might not jump out at you. Some of the things you'd be surprised at that I think I alluded to earlier on this broadcast were that if a child was too apologetic or made too many promises to never do it again, I would ask them to take that out, because those are ways in kind of softening it, right? If I apologize enough, or if I promise emphatically enough that I won't do it again, maybe you won't be upset or angry with me. And so that lack of what you might consider remorse is sometimes dictated by us. I think remorse can overshadow and get in the way of honest, authentic accountability and awareness. It's a means to an end, though, right? It's a tool. The LOA itself is not the end goal. It's just something that we use in the process. I tell clients, when you're practicing accountability, there's going to be some element of confession, like I said earlier, in it, which means that some of the things you describe, your parents aren't going to know about. They're just not. If the only thing that you're admitting to is the only things that they knew, I'm really, really skeptical that you weren't a little bit better at hiding or lying. Like I said, we look for justification. That's not an explanation or putting it in a story or a context, but that's that feeling that comes out of trying to take away the sting of accountability. At the same time, balancing it with understanding where the behavior comes from, what motivated it, where does it fit. Avoiding blame language. You made me lash out. You made me lie. Although I've told this story, I'll tell it again because it's such a great story. I was dealing with a mother and son years ago where the son was angrily blaming the mother. He'd lied again about something related to friends and substance use. And the mother said, kind of was confronting him on it. And he said, "Mom, you made me a liar. When I was young, you would judge my friends the way that they looked. And you caused me to be a liar." And the mother was amazing. She said, "You're right. I did do that." She took 100% responsibility for the 2 or 3% of her piece without quantifying it. She just said, "You're right. I did that." When he left the session, the mother said to me, "But how do I model for him accountability, or how do I teach him accountability? The fact that he can't really blame me." And I said, "You just did. You just did." See, we if you want more about this, the book, The Anatomy of Peace, or the book, Leadership and Self-Deception, both written by the Arbinger Institute, they talk about this paradigm of who's right and this power struggle that we get in with each other, with all relationships. And that wars and relationships and communities and families and nations are absolutely devastated when people cling to who's right. But when you do the deeper work that I'm describing, and that they describe very, very well in those 2 books, you start to see that it's not about being right anymore. And once you let go of those aspects of the paradigm, you can start to make connection. Your responses to your children as they become accountable. One of the most important processes I believe in our program is when I have a child read the letter that they get from you after you get the LOA. Because sometimes it's really triggering, right? You're upset, you take a step back, a lot of your suspicions are confirmed, you're hurt, you're angry, the trust has been, the fresh wound of trust that has been destroyed is fresh. So when that happens and you write back a letter, and sometimes I'll give a little bit more coaching to a parent around this time, but when you write back that letter, listening to a child read it really becomes a better test of their accountability than writing the letter in the first place. Similar to the way that I said they can't use it against you. If they get really sensitive to, triggered by your natural, honest responses, then their accountability was tenuous, right? It was fairly fragile. You get to identify your feelings and reactions. It's kind of a balance of not walking on eggshells and not being punitive, and that's where a little bit of coaching can help. You don't owe somebody a certain response. I remember one time when I was apologizing to my wife for something I'd done, and I was going to my ocean of shame, right? And I remember, and I'll never forget this. She looked at me as we were talking. She lifted my chin up and said, "Look at me in the eyes and stop going to shame. I don't want to take care of you right now. I need you to be there for me." And it was amazing. I was hard, but I knew she was right. And I've thought about that ever since. That when somebody comes to accountability or make an amends and there's too much shame and guilt, right? There's this self-loathing that they come with. They are unconsciously asking the person that they've hurt in the first place to take care of them. So honest, authentic, effective accountability is devoid to some degree or to a large degree of that shame. And so you don't owe them a certain response, and you don't have to take responsibility for the impact of that response. And then listen to a friend or a peer or a colleague or a therapist, ideally, for some perspective on it. It's okay to challenge them and be slow to trust and to be suspicious. I would say, I've said this before, but in best case scenarios, by the end of our program, even though it might look like 100% accountability, I think we get somewhere between 80 and 90%. I don't know, as I've kept in contact with some of my clients, and I don't keep in contact with all of them, right? The over 1,000 of them, but some of them I do for various reasons and various contexts. Letter writing, phone calls, visits to their program, seeing them later, whatever it is, emails. And I think 80 or 90% is about what we get to. So you don't have to whitewash the whole process. You get to kind of be suspicious. You allow them their dignity, right? You don't pull down the defense before they're ready, but you can kind of hold that back. And again, that's a part of accountability, is allowing for suspicion and trust. The frequently asked questions I get is, in the initial phases as we're coaching it, my child doesn't seem sorry. Like I said earlier, part of it is we don't want it to be about that. We want it to be about courageous amends. How long can I bring up the past? I guess as long as you need to. Forgiveness, I always say, comes on the terms and the time frame of the one who's been hurt, not the one that's doing the hurting. All the while, making sure that you have your own support system. So you're taking care of yourself, leaning on a therapist, so you're not unduly burdening your child. So where that line is, I don't know, but you get to have it. You get to feel it. There's no rush to forgiveness. As the new versions of the LOA come, ask questions about what we're working on. And if you don't want to respond, all I ask is that you just say that. I need time. I have to digest this. This is a lot. I don't know that I want to respond right now. That's okay too. Some things to remember. Like I said, the claim that the children make that my parents suck, we just stop fighting that. And we just, the closer and sooner we can all get to just realizing that we're all nincompoops sometimes, and in some ways, the better off we are. That is probably the best indication of improved self-esteem, is when you realize that you're an idiot, some version of an idiot. And as you forgive yourself, right, you have to do your own work and forgive yourself. You can kind of just be there for your child. A lot of us parents, because of the guilt that we were raised with and then applying that template to being a parent, beating ourselves up so much, carrying around so much guilt, we can't be there for our children. Can't tolerate it. It's overwhelming for us. We get either defensive or angry or blaming ourselves. We get impatient, or we just beg for them to take care of us and to tell us that we're a good parent. Is guilt productive? Does it motivate us? Like I said, guilt is just another version of shame, really. I know some psychologists and therapists distinguish between the two, but all you have to do is do this job for a few years and realize that so many people do the wrong thing. They tell you that. I knew what to do and I didn't do it. Why? Because I felt guilty. Guilt is not a long-term fuel for healthy change and integration. Love, compassion, courage, those are all long-term fuels for integration and health and growth. Guilt and shame are not. And I know, I said this just the other night at the parent meeting in Los Angeles, I know for myself that if I'm not grappling with guilt, I'm not practicing good self-care. I'm just not. If I let guilt run my life, I will not do good self-care. Not in my marriage, not as a father, or not as a professional. So we have to learn to feel the guilt. Guilt does not mean that you're doing the wrong thing. It's remarkable. I write this in the Journey of the Heroic Parent. It's remarkable how often guilt and shame prevent rather than encourage parents and children to do the right thing. Guilt makes us pay too much attention to how others feel about us rather than focusing on what is the best course of action for ourselves. I encourage parents to feel the guilt and do the right thing anyway. We are not responsible for what others think about us, including our children. We're responsible for our own actions, for being good parents, and for being good people. In turn, our children are responsible for the way that they choose to respond. Don't engage in the cycle of dependence. Let them feel and think about what they want to. It's not about your kids loving you or not. It's about you loving them. And loving them means that you sometimes have to do difficult things, even if that might make them hate you. As parents, we need to tolerate guilt in order to do the right thing for our children, which I think is the opposite of what our culture teaches us. Lastly, just what are the take homes? Accountability is ownership. It's owning 100% of our stuff. Accountability doesn't ask for a lot in return. Accountability is a giving thing, not a taking thing. I misspelled that, but guilt and shame are not vehicles for healthy change. They don't work in the long run. They're really, really impressively effective in the short run, but they're very, very detrimental to our long-term emotional and spiritual well-being. Accountability is difficult where there's shame and judgment. So we can be aware of that. The more capable, and I'm not asking you to ignore feelings you have, but the more capable we become, the safer we become to others for them to share. Accountability takes courage and healing. And the more that somebody is shamed or threatened, confronted, the less capable they are of accountability. And model it the best you can, no matter what percentage is your fault. Do your work. Find ways to apologize to people. Find ways to admit you're a numbskull sometimes. And lastly, accountability tolerates many responses, including increased anger. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions. I have one person that's written, my child doesn't think I'm an idiot, but I do. How do I encourage him to see me as a human with flaws and idiocies? I think we have the capacity to have our healthier relationship when we connect with our flaws and our frailties. I don't think you can convince him or her. You just model it. You can't control what they think and feel. You can just know it yourself. And if it comes from that place of confidence and esteem and well-being and groundedness, I mean, that's the way the Gandhis of the world were. Right? Gandhi was imperfect, by the way. But he talked about that all the time. When I listened to the Dalai Lama last year, he made fun of himself constantly on stage. Not in a glib or flippant way, but he could just laugh at himself. He tripped at one point when he was walking, and he thought that was so funny that he almost fell because there was no ego in it, right? And when he misspoke, he laughed at himself, right? That's being able to laugh at yourself and to talk about your flaws. So you just model it. It just becomes part of the air that they breathe and the water that they drink, but you can't really control it. But they will experience it as okay when you breathe that air in the family. All right. Upcoming events, announcements, and then I'll go back to questions. Upcoming parent support groups. I'll be in New York City on September 9th, 7 to 9. In London, it will be October 6th. I'll give you the exact location and time to follow. And then in Chicago on October 27th, we changed the Chicago date. So I'm sorry if you got the old date. It'll be on a Sunday this time, 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. on the North Shore of Chicago. RSVP to Melanie at evoketherapy.com. If you want to do a deep dive, I don't think there's anything you can do more impactful on your family than your own work, and specifically in a therapy intensive as a therapy accelerator or springboard into your own work. I do them every year. All of my children, we pay for our staff to go to them at other programs. Our next Finding You is September 18th through 22nd. 18th through 22nd. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Pursuits trip are activities. So sometimes we combine the two. I'm doing a combined one, private one next week. So where we have some adventure activities, think therapy light, mindfulness, getting out in nature. We ask all current parents to attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon or CODA or Families Anonymous. Also, adultchildren.org can be a place to go to if you had a family that you felt like was pretty toxic. I think it applies to all families, but it's a great place to go. Al-Anon, Alateen, you can go to.org is for teenagers who have a family member that's addicted. RefugeRecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired, non-higher power focused recovery program. If you want to try that out, NAMI.org is a place to go in your community where you can get classes and resources that are free. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just go to your podcast app on your iPhone or on an Android. We encourage the SoundCloud app, and subscribe to Evoke Therapy Programs podcast. You can also go to your computer to soundcloud.com. On Twitter and Instagram, you can follow us by using the handle @EvokeTherapy, and also the Intensive Lodge. You can find us by using on Instagram, the handle @EvokeSummitLodge. On Facebook, find us by searching Evoke Therapy Program, and the Alumni Foundation can be found on Facebook by searching Evoke Family Foundation. The Evoke Therapy blog, of course, has new content each week. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is still available on Amazon. All right, I'm happy to take any questions that have come in. Next question. I have a very hard time saying I've reached my listening processing limit with my son. Me too. That's where my guilt gets in. I feel I should, quote, she puts, I should be there for him, but it is draining. I've had a hard time stopping him mid-share. He is long-winded and fairly isolated, so that compounds his wanting to share with me. He's in therapy. Any suggestions? It is a battle that you and I share. And it's important that we practice saying no and walking away. What I would tell you is you have to find extra sources of support for yourself, resources, and that's going to be therapy or some 12-step program. But I will tell you the outcome of that is you're going to have to say no. And the fact that you've provided him with therapy means that he's not alone. And I will tell you this, in the long game, this is really important. In the long game, this is to all of you. When you folks take care of yourself, meaning that you're unable to be there for your children, they will be agitated, annoyed, and feel sad and hurt by that sometimes, for sure. And I want to tell you this, it will also create some peace for them, because their experience will be as mom or dad is taking care of her or himself, so I don't have to. It's a subtle but long-term benefit of self-care. So therapy, 12-step, get extra support, make sure that he has the support and then learn to say no and to walk away. It's the thing on a daily basis that gets in the way of me being my best, most authentic self. And it's because of my training and my background. So I am just like you. I'm right there with you. And it's a lifelong project for me. So thanks for asking about that. All right, folks, looks like we're to the end of the questions. So thank you for joining us for and on behalf of your children. I thank you. I will announce the next topic and time for the next broadcast tomorrow sometime. So look for that. These broadcasts also go on the podcast app the next day. Please go to our podcast app, leave a review, share it, subscribe there. Let's get the message out there to everybody. Have a great evening, folks. I hope this is a helpful point of contact, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.